Clara Whitfield crossed 1,200 miles to become a bride. Before both of her boots touched the snow, the man who had promised to marry her looked at the scar along her jaw, looked at the red trunk behind her, and said she was no longer useful. Then he stepped into a waiting carriage and left her on the platform. No apology, no ticket home, no place to sleep, only a trunk filled with the life she had sold to reach him, and a blizzard already closing over the Wyoming hills. The stranger who found her there did not offer romance. He did not promise happiness. He set down his lantern, looked at the snow gathering around her shoes, and said, "My house has an empty room. You can decide the rest after you survive the night." That was how Clara Whitfield entered Red Hollow, not as Silas Mercer's bride, as the woman who would eventually destroy the lie he had built the whole town upon. Wyoming Territory, November 1888. The last northbound train had vanished behind a wall of white, leaving the rails to hum in the cold. Red Hollow Station was little more than a freight shed, a ticket window, and a narrow platform raised above the frozen mud. The station clock had stopped at 20 minutes past 4, though the sky was already dark enough to feel like midnight. Clara stood beside her trunk with one glove missing. She remembered losing it when Silas turned away. She had reached after him, not to touch him. She would later insist, but because the mind sometimes refuses to understand what the eyes have already seen. Her fingers had caught nothing but air. The glove had fallen between the planks. She could see a strip of gray wool below her feet, beyond reach. It seemed a foolish thing to care about. She cared about it anyway. Silas Mercer had been waiting when the train arrived. She recognized him from the cabinet photograph tucked inside her Bible. Dark hair, trimmed mustache, one shoulder resting against a post as if the world had been arranged for his convenience. In his letters he had described himself as a cattle buyer, a man building a respectable future on the edge of a respectable town. He had written about a white house near Cottonwood Creek, a table too large for one person, and evenings so silent he could hear the lantern flame move. For 9 months, he had made loneliness sound like honesty. Clara had believed him. She had believed him when he wrote that a woman with a practical mind was rarer than a beautiful one. She had believed him when he praised the neat columns in the household accounts she copied into her letters. She had believed him when he said the pale scar running from her left ear to the corner of her jaw did not matter, though he had never seen it clearly in the faded portrait she sent. The scar came from a lamp fire when she was 16. It was not grotesque. It was simply impossible to ignore once a person stood close enough. Silas had stood close enough. His eyes had rested on it for less than a second. That was all the time he needed. "Your photograph was not accurate," he had said. Clara felt the cold enter her before the wind touched her. "It was taken 3 years ago. You kept your face turned. The photographer arranged me that way." Silas glanced toward the carriage behind him. A woman sat inside, wrapped in dark green wool. Clara could not see her face, only the expensive line of her hat and the gloved hand resting on the window frame. Silas lowered his voice. "My circumstances have changed." She understood then that the scar was not the reason. It was the excuse. What circumstances? A partnership, a family connection, something beneficial to everyone involved. Everyone. His expression tightened. "You are educated enough to understand what I mean." She was. He had found a richer woman, or a woman attached to richer men. Clara's fingers closed around the handle of her traveling bag. "You told me to come. I believed the arrangement would suit us. You told me to sell my position. I did not instruct you to act without caution." That sentence struck harder than the rejection. For 9 months his letters had urged urgency. Winter was coming. His house needed ordering. His business needed a steady hand. A December wedding would secure their future before spring trading began. He had enclosed half the rail fare, then written that he trusted her resourcefulness to manage the rest. Clara had sold her mother's silver thimble. She had given up her room above the freight office in St. Louis. She had resigned from the only employer who had ever paid her the same wage he paid a man for ledger work. And now Silas was explaining that caution had been her responsibility. The woman inside the carriage shifted. Silas looked toward her. "I cannot prolong this." "No," Clara said. "You should not keep your new arrangement waiting." For the first time, shame flickered across his face. It did not remain long enough to become character. He reached into his coat and held out $3. The sight of the money broke something cleanly inside her, not her heart, something more useful, her willingness to be humiliated politely. She looked at the coins, then at him. Keep it. Clara, use it to purchase a more accurate photograph of yourself." The carriage driver coughed into his fist. Silas's face hardened. He put the money away, climbed into the carriage, and left. Clara watched the wheels cut through the first layer of snow until the street swallowed them. Only then did her knees begin to shake. The station agent offered to let her sit near the stove while he finished his paperwork, but the station closed at 6. The hotel required payment in advance. The next train south would not arrive for 2 days if the weather held, and she had 14 cents after paying the freight charge on her trunk. So she remained on the bench. She told herself she was thinking. In truth, she could not force her mind beyond the next minute. The wind drove snow through the gaps in the station roof. It melted on her skirt and darkened the wool. Her red trunk sat beneath the lantern, brass corners dull with age. Her father had built it when she was a child, fitting each board by hand. It held 2 dresses, 3 blouses, a ledger book, her Bible, a packet of Silas's letters, and the blue wedding dress she had sewn during the journey west. The dress was not extravagant. Clara had made it from serviceable fabric because she intended to wear it afterward. That seemed unbearable now, the practical optimism of it. She wanted to tear it apart. She wanted to drag the trunk onto the tracks. She wanted to be 16 again, before the lamp fell, before her mother died, before she learned that being capable only made people more comfortable asking how much pain she could carry without complaint. Instead, she sat very straight and watched the snow cover Silas's footprints. She heard the man before she saw him, a steady tread, no hurry, no hesitation. He emerged from the white darkness carrying a lantern in one hand and a coil of rope over one shoulder. He was tall, though the heavy coat made him seem broader than he was. Snow clung to the brim of his hat and the dark beard along his jaw. One side of his face bore a shallow line from temple to cheek, older and rougher than Clara's scar. He stopped when he saw her. His gaze moved to the trunk, the empty street and the station door with its closed sign turned outward. He did not stare at her face. That alone made her notice him. "Train delayed?" he asked. His voice was low, shaped by long stretches of silence. "No." "Someone coming for you?" "No." He waited. The questions were simple, but her answers had made the situation plain. He shifted the rope from one shoulder to the other. "Hotel full. I cannot afford the hotel. The admission burned." He nodded once, as if money were a fact and not a moral condition. "My place is 4 miles west. The house has 2 rooms I do not use. My foreman and his wife live in a cottage near the barn. You would not be alone on the property." Clara looked at him carefully. "Do you collect stranded women often?" "No." "Then why are you offering?" His eyes moved toward the tracks. "Because the temperature is dropping. That is weather, not a reason." For the first time, something almost like approval touched his expression. "My sister died in a boarding house in Cheyenne," he said. "She was sick 3 days before anyone thought it was their concern. I decided after that I would rather interfere once too often than once too late." The words were plain. They carried no performance. Clara looked toward the street Silas had taken, then back at the man. "What is your name?" "Elias Boone." She knew the name. Silas had mentioned Elias Boone twice in his letters, not warmly. Boone, he wrote, was a stubborn horse breeder who owned the best winter spring in the county and refused every sensible offer made for it. Boone disliked progress. Boone mistrusted business. Boone lived alone in a house built for a family he no longer had. Silas had never said why the house was empty. "Silas Mercer called you difficult," Clara said. Elias's mouth moved slightly. "That may be the first accurate thing Mercer has said all week. You know him. Everyone here knows him. Would people speak well of you? Some would. Some owe me money." Despite herself, Clara nearly smiled. "Nearly." Elias set the lantern on the bench. "You can ask Mrs. Rusk. She runs the telegraph office across the street. She has known me since I was 10 and dislikes me enough to be honest." The telegraph office was dark, but a narrow strip of light showed beneath the rear door. Clara crossed the street with Elias walking several paces behind. Mrs. Rusk opened after the third knock. A heavy-set woman with silver hair braided over one shoulder and ink on 2 fingers. She listened without interrupting. Then she looked past Clara at Elias. "Your house clean? Clean enough. Sheets in the cedar chest. Food, beans, salt pork, coffee." Mrs. Rusk frowned. "That is not food. That is a punishment." She disappeared inside and returned with a covered basket. Then she addressed Clara. "Elias Boone is stubborn, unsociable, and convinced that asking for help causes permanent injury. He also brought my husband home through 18 miles of snow after a logging accident and refused payment." You will be safe at his place. Clara believed her, not because Mrs. Rusk praised him, because she included the flaws. Elias lifted the red trunk into his wagon as if it were heavy enough to deserve respect. He did not ask what was inside. He placed the basket beside it, tucked a blanket around Clara's knees, and drove west into the storm. For the first mile, neither of them spoke. The wagon lamps threw weak gold circles over the road. Snow moved sideways through the light. The town disappeared quickly, leaving only fence posts, black cottonwoods, and the distant shape of hills erased by weather. Clara held the blanket beneath her chin. "Did Mercer tell you I was coming?" Elias asked. "No, he told the town." Her stomach tightened. "What did he say?" "That he was bringing a wife from St. Louis. Educated. Good with accounts. No family likely to follow." The last phrase landed wrong. Likely to follow. Elias kept his eyes on the horses. His words. Clara thought of Silas's questions in the early letters. Did she have brothers? Any uncles? Anyone who depended on her? At the time, his interest had felt protective. He wanted to understand her obligations before asking her to leave them. Now the questions seemed arranged differently. How many women has he written to? The reins creaked in Elias's gloves. "I know of one who came last spring. She stayed at the hotel 6 days and left. What happened, she did it say. And others? I heard there were letters. I did not ask. Why not?" He looked at her then, briefly. "Because a man can call silence respect when he does not want the trouble of knowing more." That answer stayed with her. The Boone Ranch appeared suddenly through the snow, a long timber house, barn, corral, and a smaller cottage with smoke rising from its chimney. Lanterns glowed in 2 barn windows. The place was not grand, but it was solid. Everything visible had been built to survive weather rather than impress strangers. A woman in a brown shawl came out of the cottage before the wagon stopped. "This her," she called. Elias climbed down. "This is Mrs. Alma Reed. Her husband, Jonah, is my foreman." Alma ignored his introduction and took Clara by both hands. "You are frozen. I am not. You are. Men mistake silence for temperature. Come inside." The house smelled of cedar smoke, old wood, and coffee that had been boiled too long. Alma lit 2 additional lamps while Elias carried in the trunk. The front room held a broad table, worn chairs, shelves of veterinary books, and a stone fireplace large enough to heat the whole lower floor. There were signs of another life everywhere. A woman's blue cup on the mantel, a child's height marks carved into the pantry frame, a small wooden horse missing 1 wheel beneath a chair. Elias saw Clara notice them, his expression closed. "The room upstairs is ready," he said. Alma touched his sleeve. "I will show her." The guest room was simple. Iron bed, quilt, washstand, 1 window shuttered against the storm. The linen smelled of cedar and cold air. Alma set the basket on a chair. "You eat before you sleep. I do not think I can." "Then eat while not thinking." Clara removed her hat. Alma's eyes found the scar and moved on without pause. Relief came so quickly Clara almost resented it. "Elias lost his wife and little boy 5 years ago," Alma said quietly. "Diphtheria. He was in Laramie buying breeding stock. By the time the telegram found him, it was over." Clara looked toward the door. "Why are you telling me?" "So you understand the house. Grief has rules when it has lived somewhere a long time. Do not be frightened if you step on one." Alma left. Clara sat on the bed and opened the basket. Bread, roast chicken, 2 apples, and a jar of honey. She managed 3 bites. Then she opened the red trunk. The blue dress lay on top, folded beneath tissue paper. She lifted it out. For 9 days on the train she had imagined wearing it beside Silas in the small church he described. She had pictured his hand steady at her back, his voice softened by gratitude, the town seeing not a scarred bookkeeper from St. Louis but a woman chosen deliberately. Chosen. That was the wound beneath the wound. Not that Silas found her plain. Not that he wanted money more than character, that she had mistaken being selected for being valued. Clara carried the dress to the fireplace in the room's small grate. She held 1 sleeve over the flame of the lamp, then she stopped. The fabric had done nothing wrong, neither had the hands that made it. She lowered the dress, folded it again, and put it beneath everything else in the trunk. At the bottom lay Silas's letters tied in black ribbon. She almost burned those instead, but Clara had spent 10 years keeping freight records, balancing manifests, and finding dishonesty where men assumed columns were too boring to be dangerous. She did not destroy documents, not even when they hurt. Especially then. She placed the letters beside her Bible, closed the trunk, and slept with the lamp burning. At dawn, she woke to chopping outside. The storm had passed. Sunlight reflected off miles of snow so bright it hurt to look at. Elias stood near the woodshed splitting kindling and shirt sleeves despite the cold. Each strike of the axe was controlled, efficient, almost severe. Clara dressed and went downstairs. The kitchen looked as if a man had been using it only to prevent starvation. 3 pans hung crookedly, flour spilled from a torn sack. A stack of unopened mail leaned against the sugar jar. The stove fire had gone low. On the table sat a note, coffee and pot. Alma will bring breakfast, no greeting, no signature. Clara poured the coffee and tasted it. Mrs. Rusk had been right, it was punishment. She found beans, salt, onions, and a heel of bacon. By the time Elias came in, she had fried the bacon, made corn cakes, and opened the shutters to let morning into the room. He stopped in the doorway. I told Alma to bring food. She may still bring it. You did not have to cook. I was hungry. He removed his gloves. The simple answer seemed to settle him. They ate across from each other. Elias did not compliment the food until his second corn cake. These are good. They are edible. They are better than edible. Your standards have been harmed by your coffee. He looked into his cup. That is possible. The corner of Clara's mouth moved. This time the smile arrived. Small, unwilling, real. Elias noticed and looked away quickly as if he had entered a room without knocking. After breakfast, Clara gathered the plates. You are a guest, he said. I am temporarily homeless. Those are not the same thing. He considered that. What do you intend to do? Return east when I can afford it. Do you want to? The question caught her. No, she admitted. But wanting has not been especially useful this week. What did you do in St. Louis? Freight accounts, manifests, correspondence. I copied contracts for men who forgot I could read them. Red Hollow's feed company needs a clerk. You know this? I know their clerk drinks. That does not always create a vacancy. It will. He drinks from the owner's stock. She set down the plate. I also sew. Mrs. Bell at the hotel pays for mending. You have considered this. I considered it during the drive. Why? He met her eyes. Because surviving one night is easier when the morning has somewhere to go. That was the first kind thing he said to her. Not the offer of shelter, not the blanket, that sentence. It asked nothing from her gratitude and gave her back a future small enough to believe. By noon, Clara had made a list. Work at the feed company, mending at the hotel, possible room in town, cost of southbound ticket. She wrote each item in the blank pages of her ledger. At the top she wrote, What Remens? The title surprised her. She had meant to write What Is Lost. Elias drove her into Red Hollow 2 days later after the roads cleared. The town looked different in sunlight. A row of false front buildings faced the main street. Bank, hotel, feed company, blacksmith, church, telegraph office, and Silas Mercer's cattle brokerage at the corner. The sign above his office read Mercer and Vale, Livestock and Land. Clara stared at the second name. Who is Vale? Gideon Vale, Denver Money Railroad interests. He began buying land here last year. Silas never mentioned a partner named Vale. He does not mention the hand inside the glove. Elias tied the wagon outside the feed company. The owner, Mr. Danner, was a thin man with a red nose and suspicion carved permanently between his brows. He looked Clara over, noticed the scar, then noticed Elias behind her. I do not hire charity cases. Good, Clara said. I am applying to repair your books. His eyebrows rose. My books do not need repair. Your October freight total is wrong. He stared. Clara pointed through the office window at an open ledger on the desk. The page total says $842. The entries visible from here exceed 900 before the final 3 lines. Danner turned. Elias folded his arms. Clara continued. Either the total is wrong or the entries are. If I can identify which before noon, you pay me for the day. If I cannot, I leave. Danner's suspicion became interest. You can see that from the doorway? I can add. By 11:30, Clara found 4 errors, 1 duplicated invoice, and 6 missing receipts. The clerk was dismissed before lunch, not for drinking, but for selling sacks of grain and recording them as spoilage. Danner hired her 3 days a week. At the hotel, Mrs. Bell inspected Clara's stitching, handed her a stack of torn sheets, and offered payment by the piece. By sundown, Clara had earned $1.80. It was more than money. It was evidence that Silas's decision had not erased her value. She walked toward the wagon with her shoulders straighter than they had been that morning. Silas stepped out of his office. Clara, she kept walking. He crossed the street. I hoped we could speak. You had that opportunity on the platform. His eyes flicked toward Elias, who was loading feed bags and pretending not to listen. Silas lowered his voice. The situation with Miss Vale is not settled. Then I wish all parties clarity. You misunderstand. I acted under pressure. No, you acted under observation. There is a difference. His jaw tightened. You should not be staying at Boone's Ranch. Why? People will talk. They already talked when you announced a bride who had not agreed to become public entertainment. I was proud of you. You had not met me. I knew your mind. You knew the parts of it that served you. He glanced toward his office. A man stood behind the glass, older than Silas, silver-haired, dressed in a black coat cut for a city, Gideon Vale. Even at a distance, Clara felt the force of his attention. Silas followed her gaze. That is my partner. The hand inside the glove? Silas looked sharply at Elias. Elias did not move. Clara climbed into the wagon. Silas caught the edge of the seat. Do not make an enemy of me because you are embarrassed. The words were quiet, precise, chosen to move blame back onto her. Clara looked down at his hand until he removed it. I am not embarrassed, she said. I am informed. Elias drove away. Neither spoke until the town disappeared behind them. Then Elias said, You do not require rescuing. No, I suspected as much. She looked at him. Then why were you standing so close? Because not requiring rescue is different from not deserving company. The snow-covered fields moved past in silence. Clara turned her face toward the wind so he would not see how deeply the sentence reached. During the next 3 weeks, the Boone Ranch acquired a rhythm around her. She rose before sunrise, cooked only when she wished to, and spent Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays at Danner Feed and Freight. Tuesdays and Thursdays she mended hotel linen and copied correspondence for Mrs. Rusk. Saturdays she balanced Elias's ranch accounts. Though it took several arguments before he agreed to pay her, his records were not dishonest. They were simply abandoned. Bills had been tucked into veterinary manuals. Horse sales were written on scraps of feed sacks. A breeding contract worth $600 had been folded beneath a jar of nails. Clara spread everything across the dining table. This is not bookkeeping. I know what I own. You own evidence that will rot in a jar. I have managed. Management is not the same as survival with better boots. He stared at her, then he laughed. It was not loud. It seemed rusty from disuse. Alma, standing at the stove, turned so quickly she nearly dropped a spoon. Elias stopped laughing as if caught. Clara returned to the ledger, but the sound stayed with her. She found herself wanting to hear it again. Elias bred workhorses, large, intelligent animals sold to freight companies, ranches, and logging camps. He could read them with an accuracy Clara had never seen in a human being. He noticed a mare's fever before the animal showed any visible weakness. He knew which young gelding would panic at rope, which stallion responded to patience, which foal needed touch, and which needed distance. People think strength means forcing a thing, he told Clara one cold morning beside the corral. Most of the time strength is knowing how much pressure will make it break. She watched him loosen a lead line until a nervous chestnut stepped forward by choice. Does that apply to people? I am better with horses. That was not my question. No, he said, it was not. He walked away before she could answer. Elias kept his grief in objects. The blue cup remained on the mantel. The wooden horse stayed beneath the chair. A child's red mitten rested in the top drawer of the hall table beside harness buckles and twine. He did not speak his wife's name until Clara had lived in the house 26 days. It happened because she found a row of seed jars in the cellar labeled in a woman's hand. Lettuce, squash, climbing beans, marigold. Most had expired years earlier. Clara carried one jar upstairs. Were these Helen's? Elias went still. Yes. May I use them in spring? They may not grow, then we will know. He looked at the jar. She believed anything could be improved by planting marigolds beside it. Was she right? Usually Clara set the jar on the windowsill. What was your son's name? Thomas. The name left him on a breath. How old? 6. I am sorry. He nodded. She did not say more. That evening, Elias brought the wooden horse to the table and repaired its missing wheel. He worked slowly beneath the lamp while Clara wrote invoices. Neither mentioned why. The distance between them shortened through acts too small for gossip. He warmed a brick for her feet on bitter mornings. She left his coffee ready before he came in from the barn. He repaired the lock on her red trunk without asking what it protected. She stitched a tear in his winter coat and matched the thread so carefully the seam nearly disappeared. He began returning to the house for the noon meal. She began listening for his steps. At Danner's office, Clara discovered Red Hollow was changing. Gideon Vale's company had purchased 3 failing ranches east of town. 2 owners claimed they sold willingly. The third, old Mr. Pritchard, came into the feed office shaking with anger because a survey had moved his eastern boundary 60 yards overnight. Survey stakes do not move themselves, Clara said. Men do, Pritchard answered. Danner glanced toward the door. Best not to say names without proof. Pritchard spat into the stove. Proof is what rich men call the part they buy. Clara wrote the sentence in the margin of her ledger, not because it was eloquent, because it sounded like a warning. That afternoon, Mrs. Rusk handed Clara a telegram addressed to Elias. Came over the Denver line. The message was from the Territorial Land Office, in order of preliminary claim review. North Spring parcel, supporting documents to follow. Clara read it twice. What is the North Spring parcel? Mrs. Rusk's face hardened. The reason Vale wants Boone's ranch. The Boone property held the only spring in the western basin that flowed year-round. In dry months, neighboring ranches purchased water access. Elias charged little and sometimes nothing. If Vale controlled the spring, he controlled every cattle trail and winter herd west of Red Hollow. Clara folded the telegram. Has Vale made an offer? 3, and Elias refused. 3 times, the hand inside the glove. She understood now. When Elias read the telegram, he did not curse. He set it on the table and went outside. Clara found him in the barn tightening a strap that did not need tightening. Tell me, Vale claims the North Spring lies outside my deed. Does it? No. How do you know? My father dug the first channel. I was there when the county surveyor marked the ridge. How old were you? 14? Do you have the original survey? Courthouse copy burned in the records fire of 79. And your copy? His hands stopped. Helen kept papers. Where? I do not know. Clara looked around the barn, the house beyond it, the years of grief preserved but unopened. You have not searched? No, because you are afraid it is gone? Because the last time I opened the trunk where she kept documents, I found Thomas's burial clothes. The barn went quiet. Clara softened her voice. We do not have to search tonight. Yes, he said. We do. The trunk was in the attic beneath a canvas sheet. Elias stood beside it without touching the latch. Clara waited. Finally he opened it. The smell of lavender rose from folded dresses. Beneath them lay school papers, recipes, letters, a baby blanket, and a small black suit wrapped in cloth. Elias turned his face away. Clara did not touch the suit. She lifted papers one bundle at a time, reading labels, separating household records from ranch documents. After an hour she found the original deed. The North Spring was included, but the survey map was missing. Elias sat on the attic floor with his back against a beam. The deed should be enough. It should, Clara said, which means Vale will claim it is not. She examined the paper under the lamp. A notation in the margin referenced Survey Book C, page 114, witnessed by County Deputy Amos Creed. Who was Amos Creed, deputy surveyor? Died years ago. Family? Daughter in Laramie, I think. Clara copied the notation. Evidence had a shape. One piece pointed toward another. That was what dishonest men often forgot. They imagined destroying a page destroyed the truth. But records were made in relationships. Deeds, receipts, witnesses, letters, ledgers, telegrams. Tear one thread and the others still showed where it had been. What are you thinking? Elias asked. That paper remembers even when men prefer not to. He studied her face. For once his gaze paused on the scar, not with judgment, with recognition. You know something about that? Yes, she said. I do. The first supporting documents arrived 2 days later. Gideon Vale claimed a supplementary survey from 1872 placed the spring beyond the Boone boundary. The survey bore the signature of Deputy Amos Creed and the witness mark of Elias' father. Elias read the page once. My father did not sign this. How do you know? He wrote his B like a figure 8, always. This one is ordinary. Clara examined the witness line, then she looked at the date. Where was your father in March of 1872? Elias frowned. Fort Bridger. Army freight contract. Can you prove it? Maybe. Clara turned to another page and felt the room narrow. The survey had been notarized by Samuel Whitfield. Her father. Elias saw her expression. What is it? My father never came west. The signature was close enough to fool a stranger. But Clara had watched Samuel Whitfield sign thousands of manifests. His W leaned sharply. His final D curled back beneath the name. The signature on Vale's survey had the correct shape but none of the pressure. It was a copy drawn by someone who had seen the original and practiced. Silas had seen her father's signature. She had enclosed an old freight certificate in one of her letters, because Silas asked for proof of her bookkeeping experience. The certificate bore Samuel Whitfield's notarized mark. Clara stood so quickly the chair struck the wall. He used my letter. Elias rose. Silas, I sent him a document signed by my father. He gave it to Vale. Her stomach turned. The court paper was not only false, it was made from her trust, Every letter she had written became contaminated at once. The questions about freight contracts, her father's work, old seals, notary marks, the dates she remembered from childhood. Silas had not fallen in love with her mind. He had inventoried it. Clara crossed to the red trunk and pulled out the packet of letters. Her hands shook as she untied the ribbon. Elias stood near but did not reach for her. She read quickly, no longer hearing Silas's tenderness, only his method. Did your father ever notarize documents outside Missouri? What form did freight witnesses use? Did military contracts require 2 signatures? Could a copied seal be challenged if the original record burned? At the time, he framed the questions as admiration for her work. Now they formed a confession. Clara found one letter dated August 7. Silas wrote, "Vale believes old paper is stronger than living memory. I think living memory only needs the right person to arrange it." She handed the letter to Elias. "This is why he wanted me." Elias read it. His face became very still. "Not to marry you, to use what I knew. A wife could copy documents, answer questions, and never be asked why. A wife with no family here would be easier to manage." The words were cold, but beneath them was humiliation so deep it threatened to become collapse. Elias put the letter down. "Look at me." She did not. "Clara, I crossed 1,200 miles because a criminal praised my penmanship. You crossed 1,200 miles because you acted honestly with the information you had. I gave him my father's name. He stole it. I gave him the instrument. He chose the crime." She pressed both palms against the table. "This forgery exists because of me. No, it would not exist if I had burned his first letter. And Vale would have forged another name. He was stealing land before you arrived." Elias stepped closer. "You are not the source of a man's corruption because he found a way to use your decency." She looked up. His anger was not directed at her. It surrounded her like a wall facing outward. "What do we do?" he asked. We entered the room quietly. Clara gathered the letters. "We prove the signature is false. We prove your father was at Fort Bridger. We find Amos Creed's daughter, and we find the woman Silas brought here last spring." "Why her?" "Because I do not think I was the first person he inventoried." That night, Clara wrote 3 letters. One to the Army quartermaster at Fort Bridger requesting freight records from March 1872. One to the Laramie Directory office asking for Amos Creed's daughter. One to Mrs. Bell at the hotel requesting the name of the woman who had stayed 6 days and left. She signed each with a steady hand. After midnight, she carried the letters to the kitchen and found Elias sitting in darkness. "You should sleep," she said. "So should you." She lit the lamp. His face looked tired in a way hard work did not explain. "I am sorry," he said. "For what?" "That he used the hope of a home." The sentence went directly to the place she had been protecting. She sat across from him. "I did want the house," she said. "Not his house, the idea of one. A table where my work mattered, a room no landlord could take, someone who expected me to return at the end of the day." Elias looked toward the dark window. "Helen used to leave the porch lamp burning when I was late." Clara waited. "After she died, I stopped lighting it, because no one was coming, because no one was waiting." The silence between them changed. Clara thought of the lamp in the hall on her first night, the lamp that remained lit until morning. "You left one burning for me." "Yes." "Why?" His eyes met hers. "Because you were there. No promise, no declaration, only truth. It was more dangerous than either." Clara looked down at her hands. "We should be careful. I know people in town already talk. I know. I may still leave when this is over." His jaw tightened once. "I know." She hated the pain of that answer. She hated even more that he gave it without trying to trap her. The next morning, the North Spring fence was cut. 22 Boone horses had wandered onto open range during the night. One valuable mare slipped on ice and broke her foreleg. Elias found her at dawn. Clara reached the pasture as he knelt in the snow beside the animal, one hand on her neck. The mare's breath came in white bursts. Her eyes rolled with pain. Elias looked at Clara. "Go back to the house." She understood what he had to do. She did not go. He put the rifle against the mare's forehead. The sound rolled through the valley. Elias remained kneeling after it was over. Clara stood beside him in the wind. "This is Vale," she said. "We cannot prove it." "Not yet." He looked at the cut wire. "Then we move faster." By noon, Red Hollow knew the Boone fence had been cut. By evening, it knew Clara Whitfield was searching records against Gideon Vale. The story changed with each retelling. Some said she was Elias Boone's hired clerk. Some said she was his mistress. Some said she had planned the entire dispute to revenge herself on Silas. Clara heard the whispers at Danner's office and continued adding columns. Then Danner closed the door. "I cannot keep you." She set down her pencil. "Why? Vale controls my rail contracts. So he threatened you, he advised me. Men like him use polite words because they dislike hearing themselves clearly." Danner's face flushed. "I have employees. You have choices. So do you. Leave this alone." Clara stood. He placed her wages on the desk. She counted them. "Exactly correct. At least your books improved," she said. Outside, snow began again. Mrs. Bell dismissed her that afternoon. Mrs. Rusk did not. The telegraph operator locked the front door, poured coffee, and said, "I have been waiting 30 years for someone to make Vale nervous enough to show his hand." Clara wrapped both hands around the cup. "I lost both positions. You lost employers who rent their courage. I needed the money. You still do." Mrs. Rusk pushed a stack of telegram forms across the desk. "My eyes tire at night. You can copy messages and keep the register. I will not let you risk your office. It is my risk. Do not insult me by stealing it." Clara swallowed. "Thank you. Do not thank me yet. My coffee is worse than Boone's." It was not. That evening, Clara told Elias she would move into town. He was standing at the kitchen counter cutting bread. The knife stopped. "Why? Vale is using me to reach you." "He was reaching me before you arrived. He killed a mare after we began asking questions. He cut a fence. The mare was the consequence." "That distinction does not comfort me. It was not meant to." She took a breath. "If I stay here, the talk harms you. The pressure increases. Vale assumes we are acting together. We are acting together." The words came too quickly. They remained between them. Clara looked at him. Elias set down the knife. "I do not care what the town calls this." "I do? Why?" "Because I arrived here to marry one man and moved into another man's house before sunset. I have spent my whole life proving that a woman can work beside men without being owned, protected, or explained by them. I will not let Vale turn me into a weakness attached to your name." Elias's voice dropped. "You are not my weakness." No. What am I?" He went still. The question frightened them both. Finally he said, "The first person I look for when I enter a room." Clara forgot how to breathe. Elias stepped closer, then stopped before closeness became pressure. "That is the truth. I do not know what to call it yet." She looked at the worn table, the coffee pot, the repaired wooden horse on the mantel. "You do not have to call it anything." "I think I do. Not tonight." He nodded. The restraint hurt more than touch would have. Clara moved into the small room behind Mrs. Rusk's telegraph office the next morning. Elias carried the red trunk inside. At the door he rested one hand on the brass corner. "This is not me asking you to return. I know. I want you to be free to decide. I know." His eyes held hers. "But I will keep the room ready." Clara could not answer. He left before she failed to try. That night someone threw a stone through the telegraph office window. Wrapped around it was a strip of paper. "Go back east before the next message. Costs more." Mrs. Rusk read it, snorted, and reached for a broom. Clara picked up the stone. On one side, a smear of pale yellow clay, the same clay found only along the cut road behind Mercer and Vale's new stock pens. Evidence, small, physical, patient. She wrapped the stone in cloth and placed it in the red trunk beside Silas's letters. Then she went to the telegraph key and sent a message to the territorial marshal in Cheyenne. She did not ask for rescue. She asked for the procedure to file evidence of land fraud, forged notarization, intimidation, and conspiracy across county lines. The answer arrived at 2:13 in the morning. Preserve originals, obtain sworn witnesses. Federal review possible if railroad or public water excess affected. Clara copied the message twice, one copy for Mrs. Rusk, one for Elias. At sunrise she looked west through the broken window toward the Boone Ranch hidden beyond the hills. The storm was no longer only around her. It was moving because of her, and for the first time since stepping off the train, Clara understood the true cost of remaining in Red Hollow. Silas had left her because he believed she had no value once she could not improve his position. Vale threatened her because he had reached the opposite conclusion. She was valuable, not as a bride, as a witness. 3 days later, a reply came from Laramie. Amos Creed's daughter was alive. Her name was Rachel Creed Hollis. She operated a boarding house near the freight yards and still possessed several of her father's field books. She would meet Clara and Elias if they came quickly. The Army quartermaster's reply came the same afternoon. Records from 1872 had been transferred to Fort Russell, but a clerk had located a payment index showing Nathan Boone received wages for freight work at Fort Bridger during the exact week Vale's survey placed him in Red Hollow. 2 threads. Not proof enough, but they were tightening. Elias arrived at the telegraph office after dark carrying a new pane of glass and a paper-wrapped parcel. "You heard about the window?" Everyone heard. He inspected the frame. "Yellow clay on the stone?" Clara looked at him. "How did you know?" Jonah found wagon tracks behind Vale's stock pens. One wheel has a broken outer rim. The same mark showed near the north fence. She placed the wrapped stone on the counter. "We take both to Pritchard, the blacksmith. He shoes Vale's wagons. Tomorrow. I am going to Laramie, so am I. You have a ranch. You have a man throwing rocks through your window. Mrs. Rusk has a shotgun." From the back room, Mrs. Rusk called. "An excellent hearing." Elias lowered his voice. "I am not trying to command you. You are standing like a man attempting it." He deliberately stepped back. "I would like to go with you. The difference mattered." Clara let him see that it mattered. "Then we leave at dawn." He set the parcel on the counter. Inside was the blue cup from his mantle. Clara frowned. "Helen's cup. I know. The handle keeps heat better than the tin one here." She looked at him. He shifted his hat in his hands. "You do not have to use it." Clara touched the faded glaze. "Objects held grief. They could also hold permission. I will use it." Elias nodded once, relief moving through him so quietly another person might have missed it. They rode to Laramie under a hard silver sky. The road took 6 hours. Snow covered the open country, but the wind had swept the ridges bare. Elias carried the forged survey inside his coat. Clara carried Silas's letters and her father's genuine certificate inside the red trunk strapped behind the wagon seat. They reached Rachel Hollis's boarding house near evening. Rachel was in her 50s, spare and sharp-eyed. She listened to their explanation without inviting them farther than the entry hall. "My father's name has been used before," she said. Clara's attention sharpened. "When? 2 land cases south of here, both after he died. Both papers disappeared once challenged." "Who challenged them?" "A lawyer in Rawlins. He was paid to stop." "By whom?" Rachel looked at Elias. "Men connected to Gideon Vale." She led them upstairs to a locked room. Inside stood 6 crates of survey books, rolled maps, and county correspondence saved from her father's office. "My husband wanted me to burn them," she said. "Said old paper invited old trouble." Clara ran one hand over the nearest crate. "Old paper is often the only trouble dishonest men respect." They searched until midnight. In Field Book 7, Amos Creed recorded the Boone boundary in his own hand. The spring lay 180 yards inside the western ridge, exactly where Elias said it did. A note at the bottom named Nathan Boone and 2 ranch hands as witnesses. No supplementary survey existed. More importantly, Creed's book included a page of seal impressions. The seal on Vale's document was wrong. 1 star faced upward instead of west, a tiny error, a fatal one. Rachel signed a statement before a Laramie notary and gave Clara temporary custody of the field book. "You understand they may come after this?" "Yes." "Then do not travel the main road home." They left before sunrise. Halfway to Red Hollow, Elias turned the wagon south onto a frozen cattle path. "You expected pursuit," Clara said. "I expected Vale to expect the main road." They rode 3 miles in silence. Then hoofbeats sounded behind them. 2 men appeared on the ridge. Elias handed Clara the reins. "Keep straight." "What are you doing?" "Making the wagon lighter." He climbed over the side onto the rear step and cut loose the empty water barrel. It crashed onto the path, forcing the riders apart. Clara drove harder. The horses strained against the traces. Snow sprayed beneath the wheels. One rider gained on the left, close enough for Clara to see a scarf covering his face. Elias drew a revolver. He did not fire at the man. He fired into the snow beside the rider's horse. The animal reared. The second rider slowed to help. The Boone wagon reached a line of cottonwoods and turned into a narrow wash where mounted men could not pass. For 20 minutes Clara heard nothing but the horses' breathing and her own blood pounding. Then the hoofbeats faded. Elias climbed back onto the seat. "Are you hurt?" "No." He looked at her hands. The reins had cut through one glove and opened her palm. Blood ran across her wrist. "That is not nothing. It is not enough to stop." He wrapped her hand with his handkerchief while she held the reins with the other. His fingers were careful. Anger shook beneath them. "Vale sent those men." "We cannot prove that either, Clara. But they proved something for us." "What?" "They are afraid of a field book." Elias looked at her, then toward the road ahead. "So we make sure the whole town sees it." Red Hollow's county hearing was scheduled for Friday in the church hall, because the courthouse room could not hold everyone who wanted to attend. Before Friday arrived, Vale struck first. At 1 a.m. Thursday, Mrs. Rusk woke to smoke. The rear wall of the telegraph office was burning. Clara ran barefoot into the front room. Flames climbed the shelves where message registers were stored. Mrs. Rusk dragged a water bucket from the stove while shouting for help. Clara did not think about clothes. She thought about originals. The red trunk stood beneath her bed. She pulled it into the hall, but the ceiling above the back room cracked. Burning plaster fell across the doorway. Smoke swallowed the floor. "Leave it!" Mrs. Rusk screamed. Inside the trunk were the field book, Silas's letters, the stone, the marshal's telegram, and her father's certificate. Without them, the case became memory against money. Clara wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and went back. Heat struck like a solid wall. She crawled beneath the smoke, found the brass handle, and dragged until the trunk moved 1 inch. Then another. A beam fell behind her. The blanket caught fire at one edge. A hand closed around her ankle. Clara kicked, thinking the roof had trapped her. Elias's voice came through the smoke. "Let go of the trunk! No!" He crawled beside her, seized the opposite handle, and together they pulled it through the front door as the rear room collapsed. Outside, townspeople formed a bucket line from the pump. Clara fell into the snow. Elias rolled the burning blanket away and pressed his coat around her. Blood ran from a cut above his eyebrow. One sleeve was blackened. "You could have died," he said. "So could you. I came for you. I went for the evidence." His face broke with fury. "Paper can be replaced." "No, it cannot." "You can." The words silenced everything around them. The bells, the shouting, the fire. Clara looked at him beneath the red glare. Elias gripped her shoulders. "I buried 2 people because I was not there. I will not stand outside another fire wondering whether I arrived too late." She saw then what her courage had looked like to him. Not strength, loss approaching. Her voice softened. "I am sorry." He closed his eyes. She touched the scar at his temple. "I am here." He opened them. "So am I." Behind them the telegraph roof collapsed. By dawn half the building was gone. The red trunk survived, scorched along one side. So did every document inside. Pritchard the blacksmith examined the wagon tracks before breakfast. The broken wheel pattern belonged to a freight wagon recently repaired for Mercer Vale. The fire marshal found coal oil on the rear wall. The same oil Vale's stockyard purchased by the barrel. Still not enough for an arrest. Enough for a pattern. Enough for the town to stop pretending coincidence was neutral. Danner reopened his office to Clara. Mrs. Bell offered a room at the hotel without charge. Clara accepted neither. She slept that night in Alma's cottage while Mrs. Rusk moved into the Boone guest room. Not the room Clara had used. That room remained empty, ready. The hearing began Friday beneath the church's plain wooden cross. Gideon Vale sat in the front row beside 2 Denver attorneys. Silas sat behind them, pale and perfectly dressed. He looked at Clara once, then at the scorched red trunk placed beside the evidence table. Elias stood near the back wall. Clara had asked him not to sit beside her, not because she did not want him close, because she wanted every person in the room to see she stood under her own name. The county examiner opened with the disputed survey. Vale's attorney spoke for 40 minutes about progress, investment, uncertain pioneer records, and the danger of letting sentiment obstruct lawful development. Then Clara was called. She carried Amos Creed's field book to the front. The attorney smiled. "Miss Whitfield, you are not a surveyor. No, not an attorney. No, not a landowner. No. Then your interest in this dispute is personal. My interest became personal when your client forged my dead father's signature." The room shifted. Vale did not. The attorney asked whether she could prove the genuine form. Clara placed Samuel Whitfield's freight certificate beside the survey. She explained the leaning W, the backward curl, the pressure marks made by her father's damaged middle finger. Then Rachel Hollis testified to her father's field book and seal. The county examiner compared the stars, one upward, one west. A murmur moved through the hall. Elias produced the Fort Bridger wage index, proving Nathan Boone was 200 miles away when the false survey claimed he stood beside the spring. Pritchard described the broken wagon rim. Mrs. Rusk described the threat in the fire. Old Pritchard described his own moved boundary stakes. Then something unexpected happened. Silas stood. One of Vale's attorneys grabbed his sleeve. Silas pulled away. "I wish to make a statement." Vale turned slowly. For the first time, Clara saw fear in Silas Mercer, not guilt. Fear. The county examiner warned him that anything he said could be used in criminal proceedings. Silas looked at the scorched trunk. "I understand." His voice shook once, then steadied. He admitted copying Samuel Whitfield's signature from the certificate Clara sent. He admitted Vale paid him to correspond with women who had clerical experience, family documents, or connections to freight and land offices. The promised marriages created access. A wife could be pressured to copy, authenticate, or quietly explain records. Women without nearby family were preferred because they were less likely to resist publicly. Clara felt the room tilt. It was worse than she believed. Silas had written to 7 women. 2 provided useful documents without traveling. 1 came to Red Hollow and refused to help. He threatened to accuse her of theft unless she left. Her name was Beatrice Cole. She lived in Ogden. Silas admitted the Boone forgery, the Pritchard survey alteration, and 3 other claims. When asked about the telegraph fire, he looked at Vale. "I did not order it." "Who did?" the examiner asked. Silas swallowed. "Mr. Vale said paper was becoming expensive." The silence that followed was not dramatic, it was absolute. Vale rose. His attorneys rose with him. The territorial marshal entered through the rear doors with 2 deputies. Mrs. Rusk had sent the preserved evidence to Cheyenne by duplicate wire before the fire. The marshal had been traveling since dawn. Vale was arrested on charges of land fraud, conspiracy, intimidation, and suspected arson pending investigation. Silas was taken into custody as a cooperating witness. As he passed Clara, he stopped. "I was going to marry you," he said quietly. At first, Clara looked at him. "No, at first you were going to use me gently." He flinched. She felt no triumph, only distance. "You could have been better than the man you feared," she said. "You chose to become useful to him instead." Silas lowered his head and walked on. The examiner invalidated Vale's supplementary survey before sunset. The Boone deed stood. Pritchard's boundary was restored. 3 other claims were frozen for territorial review. But the hearing's greatest change was not written into any order. It was visible in the way people looked at Clara when she left the church. Not as Mercer's abandoned bride, not as Boone's guest, as the woman whose burned trunk held enough truth to stop a land company. Outside, snow began lightly. Elias waited near the wagon. "You stood alone," he said. "I was not alone, no." She looked at the crowd behind them. Mrs. Rusk, Alma, Jonah, Rachel Hollis, Pritchard, Danner, Mrs. Bell. Then she looked at Elias. "But I needed to know I could stand without hiding behind you." "I know, and you let me. I did not let you do anything." A smile touched her face. "Good answer." He helped her into the wagon. They rode west beneath a sky clearing star by star. At the ranch the porch lamp was burning. Clara stopped at the gate. "You lit it?" "Yes." "For Mrs. Rusk?" "No." Her heart moved painfully. Elias tied the horses and came around the wagon. Snow rested in his hair. The cut above his brow had been stitched. He looked tired, scarred, and more open than any man she had ever trusted. "I have spent 5 years believing love was a room that burned down," he said. "I kept the ashes because they were proof the room existed." Clara said nothing. "I do not want to replace Helen. I do not want to erase Thomas. I could not love anyone honestly if I pretended they were gone. I would never ask you to. I know." He took one breath. "But grief is not the only thing left in this house." The porch lamp moved in the wind. "I love you, Clara." The words were not polished. They did not need to be. "I loved you before I knew what to call it. Maybe the day you insulted my coffee. Maybe the day you found Helen's seeds. Certainly before I watched you drive a wagon with blood running through your glove. That is a strange measure of romance. I am still better with horses." She laughed softly. Then the laughter broke into tears. Elias waited. He did not touch her until she reached for him. Clara placed one hand against his chest. "I love you too," she said, "but I will not become another woman invited west because a man needs something from her." His face tightened. "I need nothing you are not free to give. I will keep working. Yes, my wages remain mine. Yes, if I disagree with you, I will say it. I have prepared for that. I will not live in Helen's place." He looked toward the house. "No, you will live in yours." Clara studied him. "Then ask me properly." Elias removed his hat. "Clara Whitfield, will you build a life with me that belongs to both of us?" She looked at the lamp, the snow, and the house that had once been built for another family, and had not been emptied by love simply because death entered it. "Yes," she said. He kissed her beneath the porch light, not like a man claiming what he had saved. Like a man grateful she had stayed free long enough to choose him. They did not marry immediately. Clara insisted on waiting until spring. During the winter, she reopened the telegraph office with Mrs. Rusk in a rented storefront. She worked mornings at the key and afternoons organizing claims for ranchers affected by Vale's company. The territorial examiner paid her as a records clerk, which made Danner complain that government work had stolen the best bookkeeper in the county. She reminded him he had dismissed her. He raised her old rate in case she changed her mind. Beatrice Cole came from Ogden in January to testify. She arrived carrying a green carpetbag and 9 letters from Silas. Clara met her at the same platform where she had once stood beside the red trunk. Beatrice stepped down, looked at Clara's scar, and said, "He told me you were unstable. He told me you did not exist." That sounds like him? They understood each other immediately. Beatrice had been a school secretary. Silas asked her to copy county tax forms and later demanded she sign a statement claiming she had seen a survey meeting. When she refused, he hid a silver watch in her bag and threatened to report her for theft. She left before he could. "I thought leaving made me a coward," Beatrice said that night at the Boone table. "Leaving kept you free," Clara answered. "Coming back made you a witness." Together they identified repeated phrases across the letters. Same promises, same questions, same careful search for isolated women with useful knowledge. The correspondence became evidence in 3 territorial cases. Silas eventually received a reduced sentence for cooperation but not freedom. Gideon Vale faced federal charges in Wyoming, Colorado, and Utah Territory. His company collapsed summer. The North Spring remained Boone land. Elias removed the lock from its access gate. Vale wanted the spring because he thought water meant control, he told Clara. "What does it mean to you? That no neighbor loses cattle because he cannot pay me in a dry month?" That answer was one reason she married him. The wedding took place in May beneath cottonwoods beside the spring. Clara wore the blue dress, not because it had been made for Silas. It had never belonged to him. She had chosen the cloth, cut the pattern, sewn every seam, and refused to burn it when shame asked her to destroy something beautiful merely because the wrong man had once expected to see it. Mrs. Rusk stood beside her. Jonah stood beside Elias. Alma cried openly and denied it afterward. Rachel Hollis brought marigold seeds. Beatrice brought the missing gray glove. She had found it beneath a loose platform board while waiting for the train and recognized Clara's description. Clara turned it over in her hand. The wool was stained with rust and dirt. "You kept it?" Elias asked. "For 1 minute." She walked to the station stove and placed the glove in the fire. The small flame caught quickly. "What was that for?" Mrs. Rusk asked. Clara watched it disappear. "Nothing I need." Then she put on a new pair purchased with her own wages and went to marry Elias Boone. Their vows were brief. When Reverend Hale asked who gave the bride, Clara answered before anyone else could. "I do," a murmur moved through the guests. Elias smiled. "And I receive her freely," he said. Afterward, they ate at long tables beside the spring. The water moved over stone, clear and constant, carrying winter melt toward the lower fields. Elias gave Clara no inherited ring. He had asked if she wanted Helen's. Clara said no. Not because Helen's memory threatened her, but because memory deserved to remain itself. Instead, Elias commissioned a plain gold band with a tiny red stone set inside where only Clara could see it. "For the trunk," he said. "For what survived inside it," she corrected. A year later, Red Hollow had changed. The Mercer and Vale office became a records room. Clara supervised deed copies, water agreements, and freight contracts for the county 3 days a week. She trained 2 young women to keep duplicate books in separate buildings so one fire could never erase the public memory again. Mrs. Rusk ran the telegraph desk and continued insulting everyone's coffee. Beatrice opened a school for girls who wanted practical work. Typing had not yet arrived in Red Hollow, but telegraphy, accounting, survey copying, and contract reading had. Clara taught a Saturday class called Figures Men Hope You Will Not Check. It was always full. At the ranch, Elias rebuilt the north fence with a wide gate for neighbors. Clara planted Helen's seeds beside the house. Most failed. The marigolds did not. They rose in bright rows along the porch, impossible to ignore. The life Clara and Elias built was not quiet because nothing tested it. It was quiet because they learned not to turn every test into fear. When a spring flood tore out the lower bridge, Clara organized lumber accounts while Elias led the repair crew through 2 days of rain. When a mare died foaling, Elias came into the kitchen with blood on his sleeves and grief he could not explain. Clara did not offer a lesson. She sat beside him until words became possible. When the county board questioned why a woman should supervise land records, Elias did not speak for her. He sat in the last row while Clara produced 3 corrected deeds, 2 recovered tax errors, and a duplicate filing system that saved the county more money than her annual salary. The board approved her position unanimously. Outside, Elias asked, "Did you need me in there?" "No." "Did you want me?" "Yes." He nodded as if that distinction were worth preserving. At home, they kept Helen's blue cup and Thomas's wooden horse on the mantel. Clara's father's certificate rested in the records room under glass, not as a relic of the forgery, but as proof that a true signature could outlast a copied one. Their marriage made room for the dead without surrendering the living. Some evenings Elias spoke of Helen. Some evenings Clara spoke of the mother who taught her to sew straight seams and the father who taught her to distrust totals that arrived too easily. No one was replaced. Nothing honest needed to be. And whenever winter storms covered the road, Elias lit the porch lamp before sunset. At first he did it for Clara. Later, Clara lit it for him. Over time, the act stopped belonging to either one of them. It belonged to the house. A simple declaration in the dark. Someone is expected. Someone will be noticed if they do not arrive. Someone is waiting. On the first anniversary of her arrival, Clara returned to the station alone. The platform seemed smaller than she remembered. The bench was still there. The lantern hook. The gap between the boards where her glove had fallen. A train arrived from the east. Families embraced. Freight men shouted. A young woman descended carrying a small case and looking uncertain until an older couple called her name. Clara watched them meet her with warmth. For a moment she saw herself as she had been, tired, hopeful, dressed carefully for a future another person had already traded away. She did not pity that woman. She honored her. She had crossed 1,200 miles because she believed a promise. Then, when the promise failed, she had not become a failure with it. Elias waited in the wagon across the street. He did not come onto the platform. He understood some distances had to be crossed alone, even after a person was loved. Clara walked to him. "Ready?" he asked. Yes, he looked at the station. Difficult day? No, she climbed beside him. It was the day everything I expected ended. Elias took the reins, and everything else. Clara looked west. The ranch lay beyond the white hills. The porch lamp would be lit before dark. Her ledgers waited on the dining table. Marigold seeds slept beneath winter soil. The spring moved under ice, still running where no one could see it. Everything else began. They drove home as evening settled across the valley. The red trunk stood in their front room now, its scorched side facing outward. Clara never repaired it. Visitors sometimes asked why she kept something so damaged where everyone could see. She always gave the same answer. Because a scar is not proof that something was ruined. Sometimes it is proof that the fire failed.